In the winter of 1958, a small crowd gathered inside a gallery in Paris to look at paintings that, to most of them, made no sense at all. No recognizable faces, no landscapes, no heroes, no battles, no allegories they had been trained since childhood to decode. Just colour, thrown, dripped, scraped, and slashed across canvases the size of walls. Some visitors stood in silence, others laughed. A few felt something they couldn't name, something unsettling, something free. What almost none of them knew was that the exhibition in front of them had been quietly shaped, funded, and shipped across an ocean as part of a secret campaign run by American intelligence. Ask yourself how that could possibly be true. How does a splash of paint become a weapon? Why would the CIA, an agency built for coups, assassinations, and covert wars, spend its time worrying about canvases that most Americans didn't even like? And if this sounds like the invention of a conspiracy theorist, why did a former CIA officer eventually go on the record and admit, in his own words, that the agency had done exactly this? By the end of this story, you will understand how a handful of angry, isolated, often broke New York painters, men and women who despised politics, distrusted institutions, and had no interest in serving any government, became, without their knowledge or consent, some of the most effective propaganda assets of the entire Cold War. This is a story about paint, but it is also a story about power, and about how far a nation was willing to go to win a war that could not be fought with tanks. To understand why any of this happened, you have to understand what the Cold War actually was. After 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the wreckage of the Second World War as the only two powers capable of shaping the rest of the century. But this was not simply a contest of missiles and military alliances. It was, at its core, an argument about the human condition itself, about which system, capitalism or communism, could best deliver freedom, dignity, and progress to ordinary people. And because that argument could not be settled on a battlefield without triggering nuclear annihilation, it had to be fought somewhere else. It had to be fought in minds. In classrooms, in concert halls, in literary journals, in radio broadcasts beamed behind the Iron Curtain, and, as strange as it sounds, on the walls of art galleries. Both governments understood something that is easy to forget today. Culture is not decoration. Culture is evidence. It is the proof a society offers the world of what kind of life it actually produces. The Soviet Union understood this with brutal clarity. Beginning in the early 1930s, the state formally adopted what became known as socialist realism as its only sanctioned artistic style. Painters, sculptors, and writers were expected to produce heroic, optimistic images of muscular workers, radiant farmers, and disciplined soldiers, all marching toward a bright collective future under the guidance of the Communist Party. Ambiguity was dangerous. Abstraction was worse than dangerous. It was treated as a symptom of decadence, a sign of an artist who had lost faith in the revolution, or, worse, secretly opposed it. Artists who deviated from this approved style risked losing their positions, their freedom, or their lives. Art under this system was not meant to ask questions. It was meant to answer one question, over and over, with total confidence, that the Soviet system worked. Subscribe now if you want to see exactly how the United States decided to answer that claim, because what Washington chose as its counterpunch was almost the opposite of a plan, and that, it turns out, was the entire point. Thousands of miles away, in the cramped studios and walk-up apartments of downtown Manhattan, a very different kind of art was being born, and it had nothing to do with government strategy. In the years following the Second World War, a loose community of painters in New York began rejecting not just socialist realism, but representational art altogether. They wanted no more heroic workers, no more idealized farmers, no more art in service of any ideology at all. What emerged came to be known as abstract expressionism, enormous canvases built from raw gesture, instinct, and emotion, where the act of painting itself became the subject. There was no single style, there was no manifesto everyone agreed on. What united these artists was a belief that authentic art could not be dictated, planned, or approved by any authority. Not a czar, not a commissar, and certainly not a government committee in Washington. Many of them would have found the idea that their work might one day serve American foreign policy almost insulting. The names at the center of this movement are now etched into art history, but at the time, most of them were struggling, obscure, and often broke. Jackson Pollock, a volatile and self-destructive painter from Wyoming, was developing a radical technique of pouring and flinging paint directly onto canvas laid flat on the floor. Mark Rothko, a Russian-born Jewish immigrant who had fled the pogroms of the Russian Empire as a child, was building luminous fields of color that he believed could evoke tragedy, ecstasy, and doom with the same force as ancient myth. Willem de Kooning, a Dutch immigrant who had arrived in America as a stowaway, moved restlessly between raw abstraction and distorted, almost violent figuration. Barnett Newman painted vast fields of color, split by a single vertical line he called a zip, insisting his work express something close to the sublime. Robert Motherwell, more intellectual and literary than most of his peers, poured his grief over the defeated Spanish Republic into a series of black and white paintings called the Elegies. Franz Kline built dramatic black gestures across white canvas that suggested the steel girders and elevated trains of the city around him. Clifford, still, fiercely independent and contemptuous of the art market itself, painted jagged, torn fields of colour and refused for most of his life to sell to museums he didn't trust. None of them were part of any government project. Several had flirted with left-wing politics in the 1930s, a fact that would later make their adoption as symbols of American freedom almost ironic. And here is the part of the story most people never learn. At home, this movement was despised. Newspapers mocked it. Members of Congress denounced it. A great many ordinary Americans looked at a Pollock painting and saw, quite literally, a mess. Representative George Dondero of Michigan stood on the floor of the House and delivered furious speeches accusing modern art of being a communist plot designed to confuse and demoralize the American public. Traditional artists dismissed abstract expressionism as a hoax perpetrated on gullible collectors. Popular press coverage often treated Pollock less as a serious painter than as a curiosity, a wild man flinging paint in a barn on Long Island. Even President Harry Truman was said to have looked at contemporary American painting on display and dismissed it in blunt, unimpressed terms. This is the paradox you need to sit with for a moment. The same art that a large share of the American public considered ugly, meaningless, or even subversive was, at almost exactly the same moment, being quietly positioned as a symbol of everything free societies could achieve. How do you turn something your own country doesn't want into a weapon aimed at the rest of the world? That question is where the intelligence agencies come in. If you're starting to see how strange this gets, stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more the picture shifts, like it did for the researchers who first started piecing this together decades later. Inside the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, a small number of officials, many of them Ivy League-educated men who had served in the Office of Strategic Services during the war, believed that the Soviet Union's greatest vulnerability was not economic or military, it was intellectual and cultural. Moscow could point to American racism, American materialism, American conformity, and score real propaganda victories. But there was one card Washington believed could play that the Soviets could never match: genuine, unregulated, unpredictable artistic freedom. A painter in New York could paint literally anything, including something that criticized the United States government itself, and no one would arrest him for it. That fact, agency officials came to believe, was itself the most powerful argument democracy had. The problem was that this argument only worked if the world actually saw the art, and getting American avant-garde painting in front of skeptical, war-weary European audiences required money or coordination and a level of institutional support that the free, chaotic, and often penniless world of abstract expressionism could never generate on its own. The solution the CIA settled on was to work indirectly through an ecosystem of organizations that appeared to be independent of any government. The centerpiece of this effort was an organization founded in West Berlin in 1950 called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. On paper, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a coalition of writers, artists, and intellectuals dedicated to defending free expression against totalitarianism of any kind, left or right. In reality, though most of its own staff did not know it, the organization was substantially funded and directed through the CIA, using a network of ostensibly private, philanthropic foundations that served as conduits for government money. Over the following decade and a half, the Congress for Cultural Freedom would sponsor dozens of magazines, including the influential London-based journal Encounter, along with international conferences, orchestral tours, theatrical productions, and art exhibitions across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The people running these programs on the ground were often genuine intellectuals with real convictions, sincerely committed to fighting totalitarianism. Many of them had no idea where the money actually originated. That is precisely how the operation was designed to work. If a story like this makes you want to know what else has been hiding in plain sight, make sure you're subscribed, because we are about to walk directly into one of the most disputed rooms in this entire history, the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art in New York occupies a genuinely complicated place in this story, and it deserves to be treated carefully rather than sensationally. What is documented is this: MoMA, and particularly its international program, established in the 1950s under curator Porter McRae, played a central role in organizing exhibitions that carried American modern art to audiences overseas. What is also documented is that the museum's leadership included figures deeply enmeshed in the same elite social and political world as the CIA's cultural operatives. Nelson Rockefeller, whose mother had helped found the museum, served for years as its president, and the Rockefeller family's philanthropic foundations were themselves sometimes used as pass-through funding vehicles for government-linked cultural initiatives, a practice that was more common across Cold War institutions than most people today realize. Rockefeller was known to describe abstract expressionist painting admiringly as an embodiment of free enterprise itself. What historians disagree about is how far to take this. Some, most prominently the British historian Francis Stoner Saunders, argue that this overlapping network of personnel, funding, and shared ideological purpose amounted to a genuine, if indirect, alliance between MoMA's international ambitions and the CIA's covert cultural strategy. Others push back, noting that MoMA's promotion of abstract expressionism began before most CIA cultural operations existed in earnest, that it was driven substantially by independent curators, critics, and collectors who believed in the work on its own merits, and that no solid documentary evidence has surfaced showing the CIA directly dictating MoMA's exhibition choices. The honest answer, the one supported by the actual record, sits somewhere between conspiracy and coincidence, a dense, overlapping network of shared interests in which government money and elite cultural institutions moved in the same direction without a single, centralized command structure pulling every string. Keep that distinction in mind, because it matters for everything that follows. Whatever the precise chain of command, the results on the ground were undeniable. Throughout the 1950s, American modern art crossed the Atlantic again and again, in exhibitions designed to put American cultural achievement on display for European audiences, still deciding, in the shadow of ruined cities and Marxist intellectual movements, which side of the ideological divide felt more like the future. The most significant of these was an exhibition called The New American Painting, organized through MoMA's international program and sent touring across 8 European countries in 1958 and 1959. It included work by Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, Klein, Motherwell, Newman, Still, and others, presented not as government propaganda, but as the organic, thrilling output of a free society's imagination. European crowds who had spent a decade associating American culture with chewing gum, Hollywood, and consumer products suddenly found themselves confronting something raw, serious, and undeniably original. For officials who believed culture was a battlefield, this was exactly the reaction they wanted. None of this happened inside a vacuum built only by spies and diplomats. Art critics like Clement Greenberg had already spent years constructing the intellectual case for abstract expressionism's greatness, arguing that painters like Pollock represented the logical, inevitable next step in the history of Western art. Dealers and patrons like Peggy Guggenheim had taken enormous financial risks to give these artists their first real gallery shows, years before any government agency took an interest in them. Wealthy collectors, sympathetic curators, European museums, and journalists covering the American scene all contributed to building the movement's reputation, independent of any covert funding stream. This is one of the most important and most frequently overlooked truths in the entire story. The CIA did not invent abstract expressionism's greatness. It recognized an artistic movement that was already gaining serious traction and moved to amplify it, accelerate its international reach, and attach it more explicitly to the idea of American freedom. The paint was real. The talent was real. What the intelligence agencies added was distribution, funding, and strategic timing. We need to slow down here and spend real time with the man who, more than anyone, became the human face of this story, because understanding Jackson Pollock changes how everything else lands. Pollock was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1912, and grew up in a restless, unstable household that moved across the American West before eventually settling him in New York, where he studied under the regionalist painter Thomas Hart Benton. For years he struggled both artistically and personally, battling severe alcoholism that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was not until the mid-1940s, working in a small barn-turned studio near his home in Springs, on the eastern end of Long Island, that Pollock developed the technique that would make him famous, laying raw, unstretched canvas flat on the floor and moving around and even inside it, pouring, flinging and dripping paint directly from cans and sticks rather than applying it with a traditional brush. The resulting paintings had no single focal point, no hierarchy, no beginning or end for the eye to follow, just dense, rhythmic fields of interwoven line and colour that seemed to capture motion itself frozen on the surface. Critics and the public did not know what to make of it. Some mocked him mercilessly, nicknaming him Jack the Dripper. Others recognised almost immediately that something genuinely new had entered American art. In August of 1949, Life magazine, then one of the most widely read publications in the country, ran a feature on Pollock that posed a provocative question directly in its headline, essentially asking readers whether this chaotic, undisciplined-looking painter might actually be the greatest living artist in the United States. The article turned Pollock into a genuine public figure almost overnight, complete with photographs of him crouched over his canvases in blue jeans, cigarette dangling from his mouth, paint in motion. It is worth remembering, though, that fame did very little to steady him. His marriage to fellow painter Lee Krasner, herself an important and underappreciated abstract expressionist in her own right, was marked by both genuine creative partnership and deep personal turmoil. His drinking worsened, his later work grew darker, more turbulent, and by many accounts less confident than the breakthrough paintings of the late 1940s. In August of 1956, Pollock died in a car crash near his Long Island home, driving under the influence of alcohol at the age of 44. That date matters enormously to this story, and it is something too many retellings skip past entirely. Pollock died 2 full years before the New American Painting exhibition carried his work across Europe as a symbol of American cultural freedom. He never saw it happen. He was never approached, briefed, recruited, or consulted by anyone connected to the Congress for Cultural Freedom or the CIA's cultural operations, because by the time those operations reached their most active international phase, he was already gone. Whatever meaning his paintings were later assigned on the walls of European galleries, Pollock himself had no part in assigning it. He painted, by every credible account, in pursuit of something private, difficult, and deeply personal, an attempt to externalize instinct and emotion onto canvas, not in service of any government's foreign policy objectives. The gap between what he intended and what his work was later made to represent is in many ways the emotional core of this entire documentary. If that gap between an artist's private intention and history's public use of their work is starting to unsettle you, that feeling is exactly right. And if you want to see how much stranger that gap gets, stay with us, because the next artist's story pushes it even further. Mark Rothko approached painting almost as a form of religious practice. Born Markus Rofkowitz in what is now Latvia in 1903, he emigrated to the United States as a young child after his family fled the anti-Semitic violence sweeping the Russian Empire. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Rothko had abandoned figurative and mythological subject matter in favour of the luminous, softly bordered rectangles of colour floating on large canvases that would define the rest of his career. He insisted, repeatedly and with real intensity, that these paintings were not decorative exercises in colour theory. He wanted viewers to stand close to his canvases, to be enveloped by them, and to experience something he compared to the emotional weight of ancient tragedy, ecstasy, doom, grief, transcendence. He grew deeply frustrated whenever critics or collectors treated his paintings as elegant furniture for wealthy living rooms, rather than as vessels for genuine spiritual experience. In the late 1950s, he was commissioned to paint a series of murals for the exclusive Four Seasons restaurant inside New York's Seagram building. After visiting the space and reportedly growing disgusted at the idea of his work hanging behind diners eating expensive meals, he withdrew from the commission and refused delivery, eventually donating a version of the series to the Tate Gallery in London instead. This was a man who fought, sometimes to his own financial disadvantage, against having his art absorbed into systems of wealth and status he found spiritually empty. The idea that his paintings were simultaneously being positioned abroad as demonstrations of the successes of American capitalism sits in almost unbearable tension with everything Rothko believed he was doing. He died in New York in 1970, and the deeply contemplative chapel bearing his name, filled with his darkest, most meditative canvases, opened to the public the following year as a space for reflection open to people of any faith or none at all, about as far from a piece of Cold War propaganda as a painter could hope to build. Willem de Kooning occupied a different, more restless position within the movement, having arrived in the United States from Rotterdam in 1926 without proper documentation. He spent years working as a house painter and commercial artist. before establishing himself in the downtown New York art scene. Unlike Pollock's radical break from the brush or Rothko's serene fields of colour, de Kooning moved constantly between full abstraction and distorted, sometimes disturbing figuration, most famously in his controversial Woman series, which depicted aggressive, almost grotesque female figures that scandalized and fascinated critics in equal measure. De Kooning was, by most accounts, less interested in grand theories about freedom or spirituality than in the physical, almost combative act of painting itself, often scraping away and repainting the same canvas dozens of times before he considered it finished. Barnett Newman, meanwhile, saw himself as something closer to a philosopher working in paint, writing essays that argued abstract expressionism represented humanity's rediscovery of the sublime after centuries of art shackled to religious and mythological subject matter. Robert Motherwell's elegies to the Spanish Republic, dark brooding compositions of black ovoid forms against white and ochre, mourned the defeat of Spain's democratic government by fascist forces in the 1930s, a deeply political body of work from an artist whose paintings would later be marshalled with no small irony as symbols of American anti-communist cultural strength. Franz Kline reduced his enormous canvases to stark black gestures on white ground, evoking, many critics felt, the girders and elevated railways of the industrial city around him. And Clifford, still, perhaps the fiercest individualist of them all, spent much of his career refusing to sell work to institutions he distrusted, at one point withdrawing entirely from the commercial gallery system, and, later in life, donating the bulk of his estate only to a museum built on his own strict terms. If there was ever a painter almost designed to resist being folded into a government messaging campaign, it was Clifford still, and yet his work, too, appeared in exhibitions carrying America's cultural argument across the Atlantic. Painting was never the entire story, and it's worth pausing to widen the lens before we move toward how any of this eventually came to light. The same architecture of covert funding and front organizations that supported abstract expressionist exhibitions also extended into literature, classical music, and academic life. The Congress for Cultural Freedom subsidized influential intellectual journals, funded international orchestral tours designed to showcase American musical sophistication, and organized conferences bringing together writers, philosophers, and scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain under the banner of open intellectual exchange. Prominent literary magazines received support that their editors, and even many of their contributors, did not know traced back to government intelligence budgets. The strategic logic remained consistent across every medium. Rather than crudely propagandizing, the goal was to fund genuinely excellent, genuinely independent-seeming culture, and let its quality and freedom speak for themselves, in contrast to the rigid, state-controlled alternative on offer behind the Iron Curtain. Painting remains the centerpiece of this particular story, because visual art travels across language barriers in a way that literature cannot, and because the contrast between a Pollock canvas and a Soviet socialist realist mural was about as visually stark as Cold War propaganda ever got. It would be a mistake, though, to leave you with the impression that every historian agrees on how significant or how deliberate this entire operation actually was. Some scholars, drawing on Francis Stoner Saunders's extensive research and on the earlier groundbreaking essay published by art historian Ava Cockcroft in the 1970s, argue that the promotion of abstract expressionism represented a genuinely coordinated, if compartmentalized, effort to weaponize American culture for foreign policy purposes, with real money, real institutional coordination, and real strategic intent behind it. Other historians and art scholars caution against overstating the case, pointing out that abstract expressionism's rise was already well underway among critics, dealers, and collectors before intelligence agencies took any serious interest in it, that most of the artists themselves had no knowledge of or connection to these operations, and that the CIA's role, while real, was one accelerant among many, rather than the movement's true origin. Both of these positions can be true at once. The documented record clearly shows covert government money flowing into cultural organizations that promoted American art abroad. The documented record also clearly shows that abstract expressionism's artistic power, critical reputation, and market success were built by painters, dealers, and critics working with no knowledge of or interest in serving any government agenda. The full, honest picture sits at the intersection of both facts, and any account that ignores either half is telling you less than the whole truth. For years, none of this was public knowledge, and that secrecy was, of course, the entire point of running the operation through supposedly independent foundations in the first place. The unravelling began in the mid-1960s, when investigative journalists started uncovering evidence that a number of ostensibly private American foundations were in fact channeling CIA funds to organizations including the National Student Association and eventually cultural groups connected to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The revelations spread through the press over 1966 and 1967, culminating in one of the most remarkable moments in this entire story. A former CIA officer named Thomas Braden, who had personally overseen much of the agency's international cultural funding program, published a magazine article publicly defending the operation, arguing without embarrassment that supporting artists, writers, and intellectuals abroad had been not just acceptable but necessary in the fight against Soviet influence. It was an extraordinary admission made openly by someone who had helped run the program himself. In the years that followed, further congressional investigations into the CIA's broader domestic and international activities during the 1970s brought additional scrutiny to covert cultural operations, and subsequent decades of scholarship, journalism, and gradually declassified material allowed historians like Saunders to reconstruct the fuller picture that we understand today. What had once circulated as whispered speculation in art world circles became piece by piece documented history. So return for a moment to that gallery in Paris in 1958, to the confused and curious crowd standing in front of the paintings none of them could fully explain. They had no idea that the exhibition around them had been shaped by forces far beyond the artists whose names were printed on the wall labels. They had no idea that a government thousands of miles away believed that what they were looking at might help win an ideological war it could never fight with weapons. And the astonishing thing is that the paintings themselves never changed. A Pollock is still a Pollock. A Rothko still radiates whatever it radiated the day the paint dried. The meaning layered on top of the work by intelligence officials, museum directors, and foreign policy strategists was always something added from the outside, never something the artists themselves put there. If you've made it this far, you've just watched one of the strangest hidden chapters of the Cold War unfold, so take a second, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which artist in this story surprised you the most, because there is far more of this hidden history still waiting to be uncovered. What makes this story endure decades after the last covert check was written to the Last Front Foundation is not simply that a government secretly funded some art exhibitions. It's the deeper irony sitting underneath the whole affair, the very qualities that made abstract expressionism valuable as propaganda, its refusal to explain itself, its resistance to any single fixed meaning, its total independence from state control, were the exact same qualities that made it impossible for any government to fully own. Pollock never painted a single canvas for Washington. Rothko never picked up a brush to serve foreign policy. De Kooning, Newman, Motherwell, Klein, and Still never sat in a room with an intelligence officer planning how their work might be used. They painted out of obsession, grief, ambition, and a stubborn, sometimes self-destructive need to say something true on canvas that could not be said any other way. History simply happened to place their work in the middle of a war they never asked to fight, and perhaps that is the most quietly devastating fact in this entire chapter of the Cold War, that some of the most fiercely independent minds America ever produced became, without their knowledge and entirely against their intentions, its most persuasive ambassadors. The paint dried the same way it always would have. It was the rest of the world, watching from behind a divided continent, decided what it meant.